Emmi Beuger's Day Off, the weekly opinion and editorial podcast from the Daily Collegian. I was so busy this week with all my work at the Collegian that I needed to take a day off to record this podcast.
And I'm Nick Souza, and typically speaking, I am your moderator, but that will not be my role today. As your host and my partner, Emmi Beuger, will actually serve as a moderator today, so I'll just be the timekeeper. So most of my impact will be pretty silent. I'll just be signaling our two guests today, which Emmi will introduce.
So our topic today is sanctuary cities and sanctuary campuses, mainly sanctuary campuses. So this has been in the news a lot lately with the Trump executive order that came out on January 26th. And in the order, Donald Trump talked about the tens of thousands of removable aliens in the United States who are being released into their communities due to sanctuary cities, saying that many are criminal, charged with criminal offenses, or the charge had never been resolved. So one of the issues with sanctuary campuses and sanctuary cities is the funding from the federal government, as well as ICE requests that the federal government gives to these cities and campuses about illegal immigrants, and how the legal definition is different, and just a lot of murky information about really what this is about. So today we have two guests. We have Brad Polumbo and James Mazarakis. And so, Brad, you wrote an article about the sanctuary campus initiatives that we're showing here on campus. So your piece, Sanctuary Status Would Endanger Our Campus for All, caused some stir on the web with some competing views. So just tell us a little bit about your article.
Hi, Emmi. Thanks for having me on this show. So essentially, my argument about this sanctuary campus movement is that we're talking about an extremely small subset of the UMass community that would be undocumented. My argument is the vast majority of these students are not going to be in danger of deportation or other negative action being taken against them. My argument is that UMass currently has many policies in place to protect these students, but taking the additional step of declaring UMass a sanctuary and actually defying the federal government for resisting federal law would have consequences that vastly outweigh the benefits of protecting such a small portion that would probably not be in danger, in my opinion. These consequences include federal financial aid funding, especially.
And James, we'll have your response to him as well.
Yep. Cool. So, thank you guys for having me here, and thanks, Brad, for coming. I think this is a really good debate to have. I think that a lot of people are kind of struggling with a lot of the details, and I think one point you made was that you're not sure that there will be, obviously, a lot of people who are affected. Obviously, the odds of how many people are undocumented and violent criminals pretty low on UMass Amherst campus, but the problem with a lot of this legislation that's coming about, or at least a lot of it is rhetoric, honestly, is that there's a whole lot of loose language, and we have, I think the sanctuary campus movement has some genuine fears about whether or not they will keep to their rhetoric of only deporting violent criminals, and the reason for that is because if we're applying numbers, if we're trying to get a certain number of people deported, if they want to really show that they made an impact, it's going to be very difficult to take that many people out, and they would have to cut into people who would be wrongly taken out otherwise. So I think we should.
Sure. So my question for both of you is, if UMass were to become a sanctuary campus, what would the impacts, in your view, be on funding or the funding issues as well as federal government?
Sure. So my view on it is essentially that we can look back at Donald Trump with the campaign trail, where he said, to quote him, that any jurisdiction that declares itself a sanctuary will be defunded. And, he's actually been following up with many of his promises, as we've been seeing. And he did so in an executive order entitled Enhancing Public Safety in the Interior of the United States. And in Section 2C of this executive order, he establishes the executive policy that allows for the withholding of federal funds to sanctuary jurisdictions. And we've also seen, not just from the executive branch, but also from the legislative, which ultimately has the power of the purse, I think indisputably, we've seen a bill introduced in the House of Representatives by Representative Hunter, a California Republican, called No Funding for Sanctuary Campuses Act. And essentially this calls for the loss of all Title IX funds from campuses that defy federal immigration law or resist ICE, which would have absolutely terrible impacts for a large portion of our student body that depend on federal Pell Grants and Stafford loans.
So I think that when we talk about federal funding, obviously I actually was not aware about the legislative branch rumblings, and that's actually very concerning to me because one of the things I was thinking that there's not really a lot of precedent for a president to take punitive action on a campus, on an education, a public institution, willy-nilly. Congress has a little bit more power, but I still think that that's going to be hotly disputed, and I'm pretty skeptical that it would be able to get away with such something that is not really based in a whole lot of civil precedent. And we can kind of go back and forth about this, and
So what I would respond to that is I would actually disagree with the notion that there's not a lot of precedent. I think if you look at, for example, federal drinking age, right, the reason that every state has a drinking age of 21 is because the federal government ties highway funding directly to the fact that they have that requirement. And if they don't have that requirement, they lose federal highway funding. The same thing is true with Title IX funding currently, actually. The Title IX financial aid is currently tied to all sorts of, I'm sure you've heard Title IX, it's a sexual harassment. There's an element to that. Well, if schools fail to comply with the harassment element of it, they lose funding. So I think we've actually seen a clear precedent. I mean, there have been cases where courts have overruled it and say the government can't coerce the states in certain ways, but we've also seen cases where it's clearly allowed for the government to kind of dangle the carrot of federal funding, and I'm arguing that this would be an instance that could potentially happen.
Yeah, and I think that the highway is, I feel like, slightly different because they offered those highway grants first, and the idea that, I mean, it is true that they are dangling, obviously, for highway grants, but that's a gift if you succumb to our rules. That's different from coming out and saying, if you participate in this action, we are going to defund you, or we're no longer going to serve you grants. And that has a very, very strong, different connotation, because that's talking about like punitive action upon a student populace, which honestly, it's kind of crazy that we're taking threats from the president about whether or not we should get money based on our, what is currently not necessarily illegal, but more sort of out of the bounds of what we have kind of debated.
So one of the biggest areas with sanctuary campuses and the issue with sanctuary campuses and cities is that there's not really a legal holding on the definition or a legal holding in making a campus or a city a sanctuary. And so for both of your arguments, what do you see as the obstacles that faces when we're trying to move forward as a country, as well as like with this executive order? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so what I think that UMass is already a sanctuary in everything but name. UMass Chancellor Subuswamy sent out an email a while ago establishing the policy very clear. UMass PD does not gather information about citizenship status of the students. UMass actually doesn't release student information unless they're compelled to by a court. And they provide free attorney services to students with undocumented issues regarding that. So I think what we've seen UMass do everything they can. Obviously, UMass is a very liberal university. We all, I think, have a lot of compassion for the plight of undocumented individuals. And we've done everything we can within the realms of the law without endangering our university's campus. So we've made it a sanctuary in all but name. And I think that to become a real sanctuary campus, like they're calling for, means defying federal law, which is simply something a state university that relies on federal funds can't do.
Well, I think that's a great point. Obviously, that's really big point of contention to how much the chancellor has gone. And I know that one of the things that you indicated that a lot of the sanctuary campus movements are not satisfied with is that they want them to object to the court order. And I want to be clear that I do think that we should be on board with this. Like, this is not something that I think should be enforced on the school if really people don't want this to happen. Obviously, it is a risk. And I think that this is, to some extent, a point of civil disobedience. And what this gesture is to say that, like, no court order, no anything, you're not getting in, is sort of banding together with other schools who've had the same thing. And the more schools that do it, the more risky it is for the government to do it. And so I want to be clear that that is civil disobedience. There probably will be some rule breaking. And I think it is up to the campus itself to decide whether or not that's a risk that they're worth taking. I personally think it is. I think it's a good stand because I think when we talk about undocumented immigrants, we're talking about, we're talking about our classmates, we're talking about our teachers, we're talking about the people who are serving us food.
So I think I would actually disagree on a couple points. I think that when we're talking about the type of undocumented immigrants that are going to be prioritized for deportation, I think with the exception of a very small number of cases, we're not talking about our classmates. In Donald Trump's recent executive order, he preserved DACA. He preserved the DREAM Act, right? So anyone who was brought here as a child, and in that circumstance, is going to be totally safe. Additionally, he called for the prioritization of undocumented individuals who have committed or have been accused of committed additional crimes. And I think that most UMass students wouldn't have any, hopefully, wouldn't have any type of serious criminal allegations against them. And if they do, that presents an issue in and of itself. And I'd argue that no, it's just not worth the risk, because ultimately, this type of risk, well, we're not just risking our own rights, we're risking the opportunities of the poorest students at UMass. You know, the poorest students at UMass are the ones that rely the most on this federal financial aid. The people in the 0 to 30K family income bracket receive an average of $15,000 in federal financial aid. And we don't know if they would really defund UMass or not, but if we're opening the door to that, we're putting their future at doubt. You know, how is somebody from that type of a family income bracket going to come up with $15,000 extra? And I just don't think that this movement, which I argue would probably not affect almost any UMass students, these deportation orders, I don't think it's worth the risk, frankly. And I do think that the risk outweighs any benefit.
Yeah, I would say that the president opened that door. He was the first person I believe he was the first person to call for that. I could be incorrect about that. I don't know if anyone knows for sure. But he was definitely one of the big proponents of that at the beginning. And the threat turns real when people fear it. And I also want to go back to your point before about that people will not, probably UMass people will not be taken. And I hope you're right. I really do. But what I fear is that when we talk about deportations, I do think the president is looking to get a very big gig out of this. You know, they're looking to deport a ton of people because that will validify his claim. And I don't think that they're going to find that many violent undocumented immigrants. In fact, there's a Pew Research study a few years ago that showed that the people who are undocumented typically are far less violent anyway, and their children become more violent when they're assimilated. So I think that it's going to be hard for him to find that many people. And once he stops finding more people, he's going to have to find more excuses to take more people out. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would just quickly, I'd respond that, yes, I see your point that there's not going to be as many as he thinks, right? Like, I think most of us can agree on that the vast majority of illegal immigrants aren't committing crimes. They aren't peaceful, almost like citizens. But the distinction I would make there is that he doesn't have support. You know, his supporters don't support deporting dreamers. They don't support deporting illegal immigrants that have done nothing wrong, especially in the Congress, especially the congressional Republicans. They don't support that. And to your argument that he's not going to be able to find any illegal criminal aliens who have committed other acts, well, Obama prioritized those individuals, and he deported almost 3 million people. So that's how I would respond to that.
Yeah.
We'll move on now to the next question from Emmi.
Okay. So, actually, 3. Number. Okay, so I have one question for each of you, and then you can do one response. So I'll ask Brad, and then you can give a response, and I'll ask you, and then Brad can give a response. So these are specialized towards your 2 different positions. So Brad, you were talking about how if UMass is defunded, that people will lose federal funding across the board. And in a statement made by Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, he said that the president wouldn't be able to cut across the board due to previous Supreme Court cases because the United States federal government is not able to defund states that do not comply across the board. So how does your argument fit into that precedent?
So I think that you have to look at Governor de Blasio's statement from the view of his own perspective. You know, he is, I believe, the mayor of a sanctuary city.
Yes,
right?
He is.
So he's coming at that from his angle, and there's certainly murky waters. You know, there have been cases like with the Affordable Care Act, where the Supreme Court has prevented the government from withholding federal funds. There are other precedents that I talked about earlier where they are able to do so. And I actually agree with your contention that there's a possibility the president wouldn't be able to do this, right? That's kind of up for debate. It's still a little scary, the prospect of him having a bullseye for UMass if we declared this, because even if he couldn't directly attack our funding, the president of the United States is not a good adversary for the university to have. But I think what really scares me, and I should have talked about this more in my article, is congressional Republicans who I believe could get support for acts that fund the university, because ultimately Congress controls the budget. They do have power. They have wide latitude over the power of the purse, and I think it would be hard to make an argument that the Supreme Court wouldn't let them affect budgeting. I don't think that they could totally defund UMass, all federal money. That's never going to happen. But even just a substantial portion of it through Title IX or another different avenue being rerouted or taken away would have enormous consequences for the UMass community.
And do you have a response?
Not much on that point, but
Okay.
I mean, again, it is a risk. I think we're all clear about it, and I did do a little bit of running the numbers, and let me look them up. So we do have quite a substantial amount of money from our grants and contracts, and a lot of those, I know about like 108,000 of those are operating, or like they're not really up for debate. They're already contracted, and I would say probably based on I'm not very experienced in budgeting, I will say, but it looks like there's about 30 million out there that could be vulnerable in different aspects. And what you said was right. I mean, like defunding the whole campus that's not fully going to happen. We get a lot of money from the state too, and if the state does support legislation for Sanctuary State, which I believe is on the board, they might actually offer money to help out with that. So I think it's something to think about.
Do you have like a really quick response?
Yeah, I just wanted to say really quickly that I agree that Mass is also debating becoming a sanctuary state, but I'd point out the fact that UMass is already really expensive, and losing any funding would just make it harder for students to afford UMass. Also, the state does not have a good track record of supporting and funding UMass. There's been declining state support for UMass over the recent years, so I'm a little bit skeptical of the prospect that we could replace federal funding with more from the state, especially with Charlie Baker as our governor.
So, James, my question for you.
Yeah.
So, with sanctuary cities and sanctuary campuses, there's been a lot of debate. And a recent poll showed that 80% of voters disagree with sanctuary cities, but there have been student governments across the country, such as Florida State University, who passed a referendum saying that they would become a sanctuary campus, whereas here at UMass, they recently withdrew the sanctuary campus. So, my question to you is this just kind of like a passing fad? Do you think that this will actually become effective, and do you think people actually agree with attempting or making places sanctuary campuses or cities?
Cool. Well, I think the answer really boils down to what the students here who are advocating it are doing. Like I said before, this is something that the school should be on board with to some extent in order to follow through with. And there are some really passionate students who I think are doing some really model volunteerism, activism. And I think that's where it boils down to how much they can convince people on campus. And what I do have concerns about is when we talk about very large-scale sanctuary movements. Like Sanctuary State is a little bit far-fetched because, there are a lot of people who disagree, which is why I think it should start from the bottom up. Really, people who are in small communities like UMass Amherst, which is obviously a very liberal, like you said, liberal campus. And I think that the grassroots are what going to define how this goes up. And I really think that they have a very good case to make in the days, months ahead. I don't think it's a passing fad because I think that Trump is going to keep immigration as a priority policy, and I don't think that students are going to let go of that, especially since a lot of the students feel they're affected by the immigration policies that he's making.
Okay, and we'll let Brad respond, and then I'll let you respond to his response because I let him.
Yeah. Awesome. So the only thing that I would say on this topic is that I don't think that actually the majority of the UMass students would support this movement. I think if a very vocal and passionate minority of the students definitely support. The people we see at the protests, people we see writing op-eds in favor of it, etc. And that's a very vocal, passionate minority, but I think we've really not seen any evidence that the overwhelming majority of UMass students are open to this policy. And I think that that's what you would need. But even that might not be enough, because ultimately, even if 80% of this campus was on board, well, that 20% still gets dragged along for a ride, still gets their financial aid jeopardized, potentially. I think we can all agree it's a possibility, whether we think it would happen or not. And that's not, to me, an acceptable outcome. And I would just frankly argue that most people don't support this sanctuary campus once they kind of get past the emotional argument, I think we all have compassion for undocumented individuals. And a lot of people that just look at it on the surface level say, why shouldn't we help them? I feel bad. They shouldn't be deported. And I agree with that. But I think a lot of people, if they really read my article or really looked into the facts of the situation, would realize that the consequences outweigh the benefits.
I would hesitate to make any claim either way about how the campus feels overall. I think it is hard to know, but I don't think that it's likely necessarily that there's a strong opinion either way. I think that what we've seen from a lot of the reception of your article and plenty of other discussions that we've had on campus have been controversial, and usually movements don't just crop up if they're a vocal minority. Vocal minorities rarely have any wielding power, in my experience with activism. So I'm not saying necessarily that it's more than 50%, more than 80%. I mean, definitely not 100%, obviously. But I think it's really hard to make any kind of estimation without any kind of polling. And I think that, again, it's up to the activists on campus to come up with those responses and find out.
Okay, so Emmi, I think you have one last question.
Last question.
With that.
So in this question, kind of be like our little wrap-up. So kind of just like, wrap up your argument. So with a lot of executive orders, they can be overturned. They are reviewed by the Supreme Court. They are reviewed by federal courts, as we've seen. And with that, there's changes made. So what do we see as the future going forward of this executive order of sanctuary campuses, of sanctuary cities? And what do we think is going to happen as a result?
So I think, honestly, what you're going to see is the majority of colleges staying away from this sanctuary campus tag. Because ultimately, they're going to, behind the scenes, the administrators are going to run the cost-benefit analysis. They're going to look at their financial aid, their funding. They know they need it more. And what I think you're going to see is, without this sanctuary policy, we're not going to see it go into place at most universities. But if Trump starts going after innocent college students, I think you'll see a public outroar against that. I know I would be against that, even if I don't necessarily support this policy. But ultimately, I don't think that will happen. I think if it starts to happen, there'll be such a public outcry that it wanes down. But ultimately, I do think that Chancellor Subaswamy and the UMass administration, they've been under pressure for months to adopt this sanctuary tag, and they've maintained the steps that they currently do to protect undocumented students, but they haven't gone along with it. And I think that points to the fact that at the end of the day, they're very liberal, they have a lot of compassion for undocumented immigrants, but they, like me, agree that this policy is not best for UMass.
Well, I think that this is just part one of a very, very long, actually not even part one, I would say part X, Y, Z of a very, very long conversation on immigration. I think really depends on who is going to be in office in 4 years and 8 years and 16 years, but the American people overwhelmingly support better immigration policy, path to citizenship, and, just smarter immigration rather than this sort of deportation system of just obviously getting violent criminals is one thing, but it's a little bit of a whole lot of rhetoric that we're not really sure about. But I think that what this movement here on campus has a lot to do with is education. Education about the stories of these people, really how long the struggle has been. And I think even if it's not successful, I think that they're going to have a very big impact on campus in the long term as more things develop. And we'll see how that goes. We don't know how long Trump will be in office. We don't know how who's going to succeed him. But I think inevitably American people are going to win this fight, hopefully. And immigration hopefully will be something that we can resolve in a way that makes sense and smart policy.
Great. Well, it was great having both of you on. I hope you had a great time discussing this issue of sanctuary campuses. And
yeah, so as your moderator, Nick Souza, and for Emmi Beuger, my partner, and for Ryan and James here, thank you so much for listening.